and actors in development cooperation. On behalf of the entire institute, I would like to thank you very much for your attendance. In particular, I would like to thank our keynote speakers today, Professor Richter, Dr. Sharan, and Bari Salam. But I would also like to thank to all the panel guests who will be joining us for the discussion. I would like to thank our keynote speakers today, Professor Richter. I would now like to give you a brief overview of what awaits us today. I would also like to thank to all the Professor Richter will speak on media systems beyond the West, Dr. Sharan on the topic charting Afghanistan's path, and Mr. Salam on Afghanistan media under Taliban, challenges and opportunities. And in the afternoon, two very interesting panels will follow. One with the title Afghanistan's Media System, How Was or Is It Structured? And Media Laws and Processes in Afghanistan, a comprehensive analysis from 2001 to the Taliban takeover. Okay, now it is time to give you some more information about the background. The conference will take place through the program that was launched at Leipzig University earlier this year. We would like to explain and present the program in more detail. And therefore, we present now a short film that we have prepared especially for this purpose. You can watch the film here in Zoom, or you can click on the link in the chat to watch the film on YouTube. Mr. Husseini, please show the film now.
Hallo, hello, salam. Hallo, hello, salam. Ich heiße Kefa Hamidi. Ich leite das Forschungszentrum Entwicklungskommunikation, Communication for Social Change. Das ist eine Einrichtung des Institutes für Kommunikation und Medienwissenschaft der Universität Leipzig. Wir arbeiten in 3 Bereichen: Forschung, Lehre und Transfer. Und in allen diesen Bereichen verwenden wir partizipative und transformative Ansätze. In diesem Forschungszentrum wir haben verschiedene Projekte. Jetzt in diesem Jahr haben wir ein neues Projekt oder genauer gesagt ein Programm gelauncht. Medien und Öffentlichkeiten in fragilen Staaten, Beispiel Afghanistan. In diesem Programm werden 6 Wissenschaftler und Wissenschaftlerinnen aus Afghanistan zu verschiedenen Themen forschen. Wir möchten zu all diesen Themen Daten vor allem erstmal sammeln, vielleicht zum ersten Mal überhaupt. Und die möchten wir dann natürlich analysieren und auch dazu Veröffentlichungen tätigen. Und am Ende soll auch ein Sammelband veröffentlicht werden, also die Ergebnisse dort zusammengefasst und veröffentlicht. Neben Forschung, wir haben weitere 2 Bereiche, wie ich gesagt habe. Zum einen Lehre. Lehre ist die Idee einfach, dass wir die Gelegenheit schaffen für diese Wissenschaftler und Wissenschaftlerinnen, dass sie ihre eigenen Seminare konzipieren und anbieten können. Hier ist zum einen die Idee, dass die Wissenschaftler einfach Erfahrungen sammeln, wie man Lehre in Deutschland konzipiert und anbietet. Andererseits aber auch mit ihren Themen und auch Art und Weise, wie sie Seminare umsetzen, sie auch die Studierenden aus Deutschland für so Themen, die bisher in der Kommunikationswissenschaft nicht so präsent waren, auch damit sensibilisiert werden, auch da ein Austausch stattfindet. Das ist auch das Ziel. Und dann haben wir Bereich Transfer. Transfer ist für uns sehr, sehr wichtig. weil wir der Meinung sind, dass wir alles, was wir machen in der Wissenschaft, dort was entsteht, also für Daten und auch Erkenntnisse, dass wir das versuchen in die verschiedenen gesellschaftlichen Gruppen zu bringen. Und dazu haben wir auch verschiedene Formate konzipiert und auch mittlerweile umgesetzt. Das zum einen zum Beispiel wollen wir die Öffentlichkeit in Afghanistan und Afghanistan-Diaspora erreichen. Dazu haben wir zum Beispiel angefangen, Twitter-Space zu veranstalten. Wir haben schon erste angeboten, war sehr gut besucht, haben bis 800 Menschen gehört, weil das Interesse sehr groß ist, wenn man so bestimmte Themen, die mit Medien zu tun haben in Afghanistan, aus kommunikationswissenschaftlicher Perspektive diskutiert, auch mit anderen in Austausch geht. Das ist so für Afghanistan Öffentlichkeit. Und wir haben ein weiteres Format, jetzt auch schon konzipiert, wollen wir auch realisieren, das ist Podcast. Das ist dann für so globale oder europäische, deutsche Öffentlichkeit, dass wir Themen, die wir in diesem Projekt behandeln, auch in diesen Öffentlichkeit kommuniziert wird. Dazu ist natürlich wichtig, wenn das auf Englisch geschieht. Für uns ist sehr wichtig, dass wir nicht nur Wissenschaft machen, das ist natürlich ein wichtiger Teil, aber wir möchten auch sehr viel in Austausch sein mit verschiedenen Gruppen und deswegen auch diese Formate.
Mein Name ist Natalia, ich studiere einen Master in interkulturelle Kommunikation und Kompetenz in der Technischen Universität in Chemnitz und ich arbeite als wissenschaftliche Hilfskraft im Forschungsinstitut Entwicklungskommunikation in der Universität Leipzig im Projekt Mediensystem und Öffentlichkeit in fragilen Staaten, Fallbeispiel Afghanistan, und in dem Projekt unterstütze ich die ForscherInnen und die Projektleitung in allen möglichen Anliegen.
Mein Name ist Daniel Grabitsch, ich bin administrativer Projektkoordinator. Und zu meinen Aufgaben gehört neben der konzeptionellen Weiterentwicklung des Programms auch alles Administrative, was im Zusammenhang mit der Organisation von Konferenzen, Symposien, Workshops und so weiter anfällt. Und also im Prinzip der Maschinenraum des Programms.
Ich bin Pauline Keilhold und ich studiere Kommunikations- und Medienwissenschaften an der Uni Leipzig im Master und arbeite gerade für das Forschungszentrum Entwicklungskommunikation Communication for Social Change. Ich bin Teil des Projekts und bin dort für die Öffentlichkeitsarbeit zuständig. Das bedeutet, ich bereite zum Beispiel Posts für unseren Twitter-Account vor, update unsere Projektwebsite mit zum Beispiel neuen Befunden aus der Wissenschaft und berichte über neue Events.
Und wir haben auch verschiedene Partner und Partnerinnen. Zum einen sind Organisationen, ja, die wir auch auf der Webseite verlinkt haben, aber auch viele Persönlichkeiten. Ein sehr wichtiger Partner ist Professor Patrick Donges. Dazu sind aber auch viele andere Persönlichkeiten weltweit, aber auch in Deutschland. Und die Idee ist, dass wir mit denen auch in Austausch gehen. Da haben wir auch Formate konzipiert, wo wir dann auch diesen Austausch und Dialog ermöglichen können. Dass wir nicht nur die Themen und auch die Projekte von diesen Personen oder Organisationen kennenlernen, sondern auch vielleicht auch kollaborative Arbeiten entwickeln und auch in der Zukunft dann vielleicht auch Projekte werden. Und dazu dann auch die 6 Wissenschaftler und Wissenschaftlerinnen, die als wissenschaftliche Mitarbeiter und Mitarbeiterinnen an der Universität Leipzig angestellt sind. Also es ist nicht so wie Stipendium und so weiter, sondern richtig als Mitarbeiter und Mitarbeiterinnen sind an der Uni Leipzig tätig, damit sie auch das System von ihnen kennenlernen können. Wir haben auch jetzt mittlerweile, wo das Projekt schon gestartet ist, 3 Formate entwickelt, die dazu da sind, die Interaktion und Kommunikation innerhalb des Teams zu ermöglichen. Das sind 3 verschiedene Formate, zum einen Science Class, dann wir haben Transfer Class und Master Class. Das Programm Medien und Öffentlichkeit in Afghanistan wird von der VW-Stiftung gefördert. Wir sind sehr dankbar von der Stiftung, dass dieses Programm, was sehr innovatives, vielleicht auch einmaliges, gefördert wird, aber auch die Möglichkeit für die Wissenschaftler zu schaffen, dass die in Deutschland ihre Arbeiten fortsetzen können.
believe that we will provide and enable new insight in knowledge about these contexts, which otherwise would not be possible. So these were the brief information about the conference. Now the time's come for the first keynote speaker, Professor Carola Richter. She's a professor at International Communication at Freie University Berlin. In her research, she focuses on media system and communication, culture, particularly in MENA region, and also media and migration, foreign news coverage, as well as on public diplomacy. She's the co-founder of Area Core, the Arab European Association of Media and Communication Research, and director of the Center for Media and Information Literacy at Freie University Berlin. One of her recent book and publication is the Open Access book that is dealing with Arab media system, published in 2021, fortunately with Open Access, that was co-authored with Claudia Kosman. She's also involved in academics in solidarity initiative at Freie University Berlin, supporting scholar at risk. Once again, most welcome, Professor Carola Richter. Now the floor is open to you, please.
Thank you very much for this very kind invitation and the introduction here. I'm very happy to be part of this conference and also learning more about Afghanistan and the Afghani media. As you have heard, I'm not an expert on Afghanistan or on Afghani media, but I consider myself, let's say, I consider myself an expert on Arab media systems. And I'm just sharing my presentation here so that you hopefully can see that as well. And what I have in mind today is taking you through a little tour through our research on Arab media systems and the difficulties we detected when trying to locate Arab media systems in a comparative perspective. And also, I would like to talk to you about the challenges we faced when trying to adequately describe the media systems. And since you work mainly on Afghanistan, I would like to highlight some aspects in these challenges that I imagine that you could link also to the research you do on Afghanistan. So as Hazrat just said, I'm referring here on a book that I have co-authored with co-edited with my colleague Claudia Kosman. And in this book, we have looked at 18 different Arab countries. So most of the countries that are part of the Arab League, we left out Mauritania, Somalia, and Djibouti. And we have asked several authors that are familiar with those different countries and are experts on the media systems there to contribute to this book. And the first step that we did in our editorial work, but also with all the authors, was trying to find useful and relevant categories to describe Arab media systems. And then a second step was to trying to compare them, but we refrained also from trying to come up with a catchy typology because our problem really is that there are so many several dominant media system typologies that we as scholars, but also practitioners tend to refer to. But the problem is that all the types that are laid out in these typologies often cannot grasp the peculiarities of media systems beyond the West. So most countries from the global South, including the Arab countries, but I think also Afghanistan, so most of these countries tend to be subsumed in some kind of a container category or container type, right? And this is also due to the dimensions or the categories these typologies use and the connotations that are linked to them. And I want to give you some examples here. So, for example, this is a very often referred to typology, the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. And of course, this is very important to also lobby for the security of journalists. But as you can see here, so this is the map of the MENA region. So we have then mainly kind of containers of black or red countries, meaning unfree or very difficult, where is a very difficult situation for journalists. And of course, this is something that where you cannot really see what is behind the difficulties for these journalists here, and what are the specific political circumstances that lead to such a type here. When we come to more academic or scholarly typologies, maybe some of you are familiar with this one from Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm, which has been developed in the 1950s. So they have been talking about 4 theories or 4 types of media, referring to an authoritarian type of media, a libertarian type, a social responsibility type, or a Soviet totalitarian type, because this was the type of the Cold War. So you see, there has been some kind of the good models and the bad models. So the Soviet totalitarian or the authoritarian one is labeled the ones that we need to overcome, or that are the antagonists. And then you have the libertarian or the social responsibility model that are the ones that are that should be achieved. So you have these kind of normative types that are being laid out here. And at the same time, I want to draw your attention also to the categories they used here in this red field. I tried to highlight them. So the categories they used is kind of they looked at the philosophy of the media, or what is behind the media. They looked also at the ownership structures, or who has the right to use and to own media, and then some kind of political aspects, like who controls the media, and kind of what is forbidden, so the censorship aspects. And these were the main categories that have been used throughout the decades to describe media systems. And when we go further on, for example, here is one developed by the Swiss scholar Roger Blum in the 2000 years. So he has also focused on media systems around the world and trying to explain them according to some categories like the government system, the political culture, media freedom, media ownership, funding of media, state control, and these categories. And then he tried to locate, with regard to all of these categories, he tried to locate them in a liberal, or regulated scheme, and then you had also a middle scheme. So this is, of course, something when you try to compare a lot of media systems, you have to reduce complexity, and this has been done here as well. But again, as you see here, these connotations, so this is supposed to be liberal, this is supposed to be kind of regulated, or have these connotations, or we having here some kind of negative connotations versus more positive ones, and this also creates a problem which I will tackle later on. And then there is one very dominant typology that is always being referred to when we talk about media systems. This is the one from Daniel Helen and Paolo Mancini, which they came up with in 2004. And they have looked at 18 countries in Europe and North America. So it's kind of a modelization of so-called Western media systems. And they have then developed from that 3 models, which they say are 3 types. So it's a kind of a polarized pluralist model, a democratic corporatist model, and a liberal model. And this has often been used to locate also media systems in the global south. But the problem here is that somehow all went into a kind of a container, at best in the polarized pluralist model, or some would say, well, we have also commercial aspects in our media systems. So it's polarized pluralist with some kind of a liberal appearance. So this has not worked out to describe media systems in the global south. And in particular, this is the case, I think, because the categories they used, and you find them here again in this red field, the categories they used do not really help us to explain the peculiarities of media systems beyond the West. For example, here the newspaper industry. This was something that they put into as one of those 4 categories, and they said, well, do we have a kind of an elaborated newspaper circulation, or do we on newspaper industry, do we have low and high circulations? And I mean, I guess you can imagine for most of the countries in the global south, this didn't play a role because they were all kind of latecomers to newspaper industry. So we would have to think of different things. Also something like the role of the state in the media system, is there a strong or a not so strong intervention? I think this is not something that in many authoritarian countries plays a role. It's rather, it's not the question about strong or not so strong, it's more the question about what they actually do and what kind of practices are there. So as a kind of an interim conclusion here, we said when we looked at those models and wanted to write our book, we said, well, these typologies do not help us to adequately locate media systems beyond the West. And also the categories and their analyses need to be revised. We may take over some of the ideas that have been elaborated here. They may be helpful, but we need to think of them in a new way. And I will focus now first on the analytical categories and how we try to transfer them, how we try to adapt them to the realities that we face in the Arab world. And hopefully this can also be used to analyze the Afghani media system. So the first thing that we did was to look at whether there is some research on Arab mass media or Arab media systems. And we came across some authors, and I want just to highlight 2 of them here. So one is from William Rue. So William Rue was an ambassador to many Arab states, and US ambassador, and he tried to work out already in the 1970s some kind of typology of Arab states. I think the location of the different countries to a certain type, this is long gone, so this is out of date. But what we found interesting here is that he referred to something like a purpose of media, so that the state or some political actors would see some kind of a media purpose, and this is, for example, here mobilization, which is, I think, still an inherent feature in many media, but also important for particularistic groups and militia. So we should think of this purpose. So what kind of purpose is the media thought to be like? And then he also introduced this term loyalist media. So this goes, interestingly, this goes away from Western notions of private media versus state-owned media, but he showed us that, well, even if you have privately or formerly privately owned media, they can still be somewhat loyalist to the state or to the ruling regime. And I think this is something that we wanted to highlight here and took over into our analysis. And then there is a second typology that we took into consideration, which has been developed by Mahmoud Galanda, who is originally from Sudan and taught for a long time in Qatar. And he said, well, we also need to include a more, let's say, culturalist perspective when it comes to media system research. So we should also include some kind of a socio-political aspect here. So what is the nature of society? How does it look like? We should also include aspects like religion and how this plays out in society. Is it a mono-religious or multi-religious society? And maybe also something like communication system in general, like do we have differences between the urban and the rural areas and modern and traditional forms of communication? And maybe this is also something you could think of when it comes to Afghanistan. So now I want to take you through the dimensions or the categories that we developed from that, from these considerations. And of course, you cannot neglect the political system and the legal framework. So this is an essential category and dimension that we need to look at. So the kind of governing system and how the media are controlled and regulated are important cornerstones of analysis in all typologies. However, the degrees used to measure these categories are often highly normative. So we considered here, or we detected here a kind of a democracy bias, which often leads to the problem that non-democratic regimes are simply categorized as flawed, incomplete, or transitional democracies. And as such, acknowledging the broad range of political authoritarianism and the different mechanisms of control and regulation we found is more helpful than these normatively loaded perspectives. In addition, we contend that the question whether there is this high or low degree of state intervention in the media system does not really explain much of what takes place in Arab media systems. So as I said before, the more interesting questions are how state intervention manifests itself. And it's also important to look at the objectives state interventions aim to achieve with regard to the media. So the second dimension we took into consideration relates to the economy of the media and ownership, and this has also often frequently been included in media system comparisons. But given Ru's hint on loyalist media, we think that a critical look at the political economy of the media is crucial. So in most Arab countries, state elites have secured their stakes in the relevant economic sectors. And consequently, anyone who wants to profit from this must be loyal to the ruling elites. And this has also affected the media systems. So in many Arab countries, the alleged privatization of media has rarely been more than a transfer of ownership to the regime's close cronies, those cronies among the business elites or other elites. So private media should not be mistaken as meaning independent media, right? So this is something we definitely need to consider. But in this context, in addition to this aspect of private versus state-owned, the often used category of political parallelism, also we tried to give it a new twist. So it means political parallelism in general means that the media can be associated with particular parties. So this would be the classical interpretation. But they can also be associated with general political tendencies. So we have to think ownership patterns in a new way. So we have to include funding of media by political actors, but we have also to include the degree or the kind of political parallelism. One dimension that has not been very much included in media system typologies is a reference to technology and infrastructure. And yes, we should not look at technology from a technological determinist viewpoint, but it needs to be considered as both a specific outcome of and an influence on social practices, or as Chadwick described it, it is a driver of hybridity. And this notion of a hybrid system, he argued, draws attention to change and flux, the passing of an older set of cultural and institutional norms, and the gradual emergence of new norms. So the ambivalences of setting up a modern technological infrastructure and its impact need to be examined as well. We have come up with a fourth dimension, which we termed the social composition of a society, for example, with regard to gender and age, the diversity of ethnicities, religions, and languages spoken. And we found that this dimension is often neglected. in comparative media systems analysis. What we had in mind here is that these factors suggest questions about appropriate representation in the public sphere and how through the media they shape struggles for hegemony over discourse, and maybe then also provide a fertile ground for conflicts in society. So for example, when you refer to Lebanon as one of the examples of the Arab world, crisis is actually a salient factor that stems from a decades-long confessional conflict that influences the media market, media governance, and media contact. So we have thought about this in very closely, very thoroughly, and we think that through this we can somehow describe a political culture that stems from existing and potential societal conflicts that is important to look at. And also aspects like religion need to be considered, which has become a main driver of conflict along distinct understandings of cultural identity. Ethnicity and demographics are yet another aspect, yet other aspects of culture, as well as education that links to class differences and so on. And then we have a final fifth dimension. Actually, historical developments are often reflected on in comparisons of media systems, but scholars have looked at it quite differently. So for example, Siebert, Peterson, and Schramm, they tended to relate history to a kind of a specific mentality, such as the Russian thinking or something like this. Bloom took it also into consideration, and he thought of whether there has been a kind of a historical development of a country. Has it been linear or has it been shaped by ruptures? And Helen and Mancini, as I mentioned before, looked at it as kind of a history in the forms of how media and newspapers in particular has been developed. When we think of the Arab countries, and I think Afghanistan is no exception to that, all these countries have experienced strong ruptures. So it's not really a question about whether there have been ruptures, but the question of how the countries dealt with these changes and how they included their impact into the respective media policies. So we also need to think here of colonial trajectories. We need to think of common struggles for independence. We need to think of dependencies on and influences by global and regional foreign powers, and how all of this shaped a transnational or a national identity in the media market. So this is something that I think is very peculiar to the Global South in general, where many countries have transnational entanglements and colonial trajectories experienced. So this was about the dimensions, but now I also want to take you through the comparisons that we came up with. So I want to highlight some of the findings, and maybe I also want to mention some of the aspects that I think could also be considered when we look at Afghanistan and the Afghani media system. So maybe this can inspire you a bit as well. So one of the first aspects was with regard to the state's approach to media and its mechanisms of control, so relating to the political aspect and the legal framework. We identified here mobilization and modernization purposes as the two main goals states typically refer to as the desirable function of media. So you see that on the left and the right end of this graph here. So mobilization on the left hand is often framed as an educational effort by self-proclaimed elites. So in many cases, such as in, for example, Yemen, in Syria, and in Libya, we have militias or opposing elites who try to instrumentalize the media, and with that to mobilize the population for their causes and to delegitimize the opposition. And maybe this is something you could consider with regard to the Afghani situation too. On the other hand, as for modernization, this is a claim many states use to highlight their approach to media, legitimizing control of the media as a means to foster national stability and unity and to gain prosperity. So here we have many of the Gulf states located in. And then regarding how these ideological paradigms are enforced, we contrast between a laissez-faire approach and a strong control of media. So you see that on the upper and the lower end here. For example, in Lebanon, state structures are very weak, and thus a kind of a laissez-faire approach towards the media exists. We have restrictive laws in place, but they are rarely applied. So in these cases, the state is not in a position to dictate a specific media policy. Although this makes the media system, for example, of Lebanon, freer than others, the problem lies in the inability of the state to provide legal security to media outlets and also physical security to media workers, making them vulnerable to any kinds of attacks. So maybe this is also something that applies to Afghanistan, maybe also before 2021 and even now. On the other side of the spectrum of control mechanisms are Egypt and Bahrain that exercise strict control over the media. And due to the political turmoil these countries have faced after 2011, the so-called Arab Spring, these governments view the media as potential enemies that need to be controlled by restrictive laws, intimidation by media workers, and they also control the ownership. And then, so in between these two extremes, the laissez-faire and the strong control approach, many countries oscillate between control and liberalization under the pretext of modernization and development, and it also changes over time and with the respective political situation. And maybe this is also a possibility to look at different stages of the Afghani media system and how it developed from one into the other direction. So another, the other theme that we identified when combining the often neglected technology dimension with the political dimension, we have identified here two major lines of comparison. So first, the state of the infrastructure regarding internet connectivity and telecommunications. And second, specific policies behind building a high-end infrastructure or the lack thereof. So taking these two aspects into consideration, a spectrum regarding technological advancement puts highly developed technological systems at one extreme and poorly developed ones at the other extreme. So on the one hand, on the right side of the spectrum, the rich Gulf countries are positioned and they have a very high-end infrastructure enabling literally everyone to be connected through the internet and mobile phones. And also the states heavily invest in these kind of infrastructure also to legitimize themselves as, you know, guaranteeing development and so on. And it's also an economical aspect why they do that. Then we have other countries which are located here in the middle that have also long realized how investing in internet infrastructure can help in advancing the country's modernization and economic development, but they do not have the means, the financial means to achieve the Gulf country levels. And then there are countries with an ambivalent record, such as Palestine, Syria, and Iraq, where we have a significant part of their population which is familiar with digital media. But the internet infrastructure and the telecommunications market continuously face major setbacks caused by destruction due to occupation, war, or violent conflict. And then on the very left side, we have Yemen, Libya, and Sudan with the lowest rates of internet connectivity. So in these cases, the lack is the product of a mixture of general underdevelopment, of war, of conflict, and a severe lack of governmental determination to build an infrastructure here. And maybe this is also something that needs to be considered with regard to Afghanistan. So, and if we want to do maybe some kind of analysis about the use of digital media and social media analysis and these kind of things. So one has always to keep in mind how far developed with regard to technology a country and the media system really is, and whether it makes sense, and how much we can explain from with these kind of analysis, focusing on the digital sphere. Okay, now I think I'm running out of time here, but I think we also started 10 minutes late. So is it okay to get some more minutes here, Hazrat?
Yes, Professor, please
Okay.
go ahead. Yeah, it's fine.
Thank you. So I think this is a very crucial aspect here, because here it's maybe for the first time that we also consider the social context dimension as part of a media system analysis. And what we see here is that there are clear patterns of societal and political fragmentation and polarization, which emerges in all those countries that we studied. This is not entirely new, since Arab media systems have always been characterized by a division of audiences, journalists, and content along the lines of conflict, driven by oftentimes sustained ethnic, religious, or political differences. And I think this is something that, as far as I know, for Afghanistan is also very important to recognize. So to compare these countries, we identified two dimensions. First dimension you see on the x-axis here is how the political system deals with conflicts. And then on the y-axis, how the media represents conflicts. So on the political level, on this x-axis, the country cases indicate two opposing ways of how these phenomena are treated. Either, on the left-hand side, the lines of conflict materialize to such a degree that they are omnipresent in society, and they shape often many societal discourses. Or, on the right-hand side, they are strongly suppressed to mimic political and social homogeneity, for the sake, for example, of creating some kind of national stability. So on the media level then, on this y-axis, different ways of representing these conflicts could be found, ranging from conscious inclusion on the lower level to conscious exclusion of the voices of others. And when we look again on the left side of the spectrum, in which strong political, religious, and or ethnic divisions openly shape society, we have here conflict-ridden countries that are mired in civil wars. And in all of these cases, media performance oscillates between providing an external pluralism of opinions and perspectives on the one hand, and hate speech and denunciation of the opponent on the other hand. So for example, when you look here at this cluster, the cases of Iraq, Lebanon, and Palestine, we have a strong fragmentation of the media landscape along political and confessional lines that has been in place for a long period of time. So we have here some kind of signs of professionalization that we can observe. We have oftentimes a less aggressive language or more objective reporting that has surfaced. So a plausible reason for this is the necessity of including voices of other actors in different media, perhaps to also, arrange with them in some way or another. But we also have here in the upper field, we have countries like Libya, Syria, and Yemen that are still in warlike situations. And we have here a completely unregulated, polarized media landscape, which is very dominant here, and we only have minor tangible efforts to overcome such polarization. So this means that a conscious exclusion of other actors' voices takes place in the respective media, and this reinforces the polarization again and again. We have also others here in this cluster. another way to deal with conflict. And these countries have found ways of answering the demands of the various segments of society by providing better representation, for example, through special language programs on radio and TV. And in these cases, sometimes only after a very strong political pressure from these respective groups, we see a kind of a gradual and closely monitored inclusion in the media system that has taken place. So maybe this is something that could be also some kind of a role model here. So I have 2 more themes on my list, and I try to cut it a bit shorter here. I'm coming up with this theme here, which is referring to media ownership, but it can also tell us more about whether there is a kind of a conflict, or whether it's this confrontation and conflict, or whether it leads to some kind of a controlled and loyalist media system. So we considered here both the state's general approach to media and the availability of financial backing by different non-state actors, in addition to Ru's idea of a loyalist media. And we pitted it against its very opposite, which we term confrontational media. So in our analysis, we again, we also refrain from a simple distinction between state-owned and private, or public and independent media, since state-owned and privately owned media coexist in the Arab world, but to varying degrees, and what I will show here with varying efforts. So for example, here, if you look at this bubble, we consider this bubble here leading to a loyalist reporting and loyalist media content. So we have here the ownership in 3 different ways. First, in countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and Algeria, the security apparatuses and the military play a huge role in the ownership of privatized or formerly privatized media. Then here in this bubble, countries like Jordan, Kuwait, and others, private ownership extends to influential business people who have become successful due to their links to the ruling families. And then we have here another bubble where also the ruling families and their cronies play a huge role, but they have also outsourced they have gone into a pan-Arab outsourcing. I don't explain that now, but what I mean here is that in particular, the state is not always the state. So we have different, even if there are business people, or if there are security apparatuses in the game, they also represent the state. So it's not a kind of a privatized media system and thus an independent media system, but they are always or very often then loyal to the regime. In contrast to the loyalist media, we have confrontational media. And then again, we have here the prevalent aspect in Libya, Syria, and Yemen, where you have this unregulated media, and then you have conflict actors that own the media and instrumentalize them. We also have a little bit more of this pluralistic ownership here in other countries as well, where a rather pluralistic media landscape is then also created. And this might lead to a kind of a healthy external pluralism, depending then always on the political situation. But maybe this is something that could be also a kind of a role model here. But again, we cannot really speak about some kind of independent media here. We always have to acknowledge that these media are in the hands of certain political actors, and depending on whether there is a kind of a conflict situation, these actors then maybe also instrumentalize their media and are not really into kind of an objective reporting. So my final theme is about the transnational mobility and connection with, which stemmed from the historical dimension that we looked at, and the entanglements and the path dependencies that we found in the Arab region. And I think this is also something that could be interesting for Afghanistan. I mean, in the Arab countries, we have something very specific, a common language that allows the potential outreach of media to publics beyond the national borders and enable also the movement of content and production in a way that is not possible elsewhere. But we also have problems to this transnational connectedness. We have border closures, we have visa regimes, and I think this is something that needs to be considered as well. But still, transnational aspects are really important to understand the media systems. So I want to highlight maybe only one thing here due to a lack of time. I think here these two groups could be super interesting for Afghanistan too. We have this group here where it's written strong diasporas, which comprise of Bahrain, Sudan, Libya, and Yemen, for example. They have substantial and very active diasporas that produce a sizable amount of media content from abroad. So, for example, Libyan and Yemeni political actors operate entire systems of TV channels from abroad. We have in Bahrain a very active exile community that are highly present online. The content that is produced is not meant to target audiences other than the ones in the home country. So the diaspora strongly focus on sending something into Bahrain, into Libya, and so on. So here the transnational element is not the diasporic media production, but it's the kind of it's really meant to be for the home country. And then we have this one group here where it's called workforce deployers, and here we have in those countries many media workers exist that go out of their own country and that operate the pan-Arab TV stations in the Gulf, such as Al Jazeera and other channels. But they also have a substantial diaspora spread over the MENA region and in Europe as well. And these diasporas often consume the media. And these diasporas often consume the media of their home countries as well. So I think in general, it's very important to include these transnational entanglements of media production. So I'm coming to the very end now, and I think I really stretched out my time here, sorry for that. I hope you got some inspiration on what to consider when analyzing media systems beyond the West and can transfer it also to the case of Afghanistan. And you have probably noticed that even when we look at Arab media that are considered part of the global South and that are considered authoritarian regimes, more or less, we already have seen that there are so many differences and differences regarding the performance and differences regarding the structures. So there is no one size fits all model. But maybe in a nutshell, I suggest to look at practices rather than on the legal text. Get rid of Western assumptions on business models and ownership characteristics. Put the aspect of representation in dealing with conflict as a central category. And of course, do not neglect these transnational entanglements and the questions of technology. And thank you very much for listening, and hopefully you got some inspiration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this thorough and comprehensive tour about what media system is and how media system in global South, particularly in MENA, that is also somehow close to Afghanistan. When I was looking into the presentation, I was thinking that, yeah, it is more relevant and very close compared to the one that has been developed previously, the highly cited one, the media system. But we have been already, I think, yeah, out of time, running out of time. Sorry. But still, it's okay because we did not want to interrupt the content, and the overall the concept was important for our next three panels too. Just one questions I will try to have, and I'm sorry for those audience who are having their questions, but just one question, Professor. Yeah, I've been noticing the dimension very close to Afghanistan too, that could be applicable, not thoroughly, but somehow that was close. But just one point, when you were talking about the political system, I think Afghanistan political system, if we look at the history of that system, there are fluctuation. Sometimes it was very democratic, some was very undemocratic, and then, as you mentioned, also a strong rupture. So to combine all these points, we could just maybe put into the state fragility of Afghanistan. So because although in other Arab countries, there might be kind of political changes in their cases too. But when it's come to Afghanistan, it's totally, they replace the previous system, political system, with a new one, with their totally new concepts of the type of the government. So to praise my questions, how that state fragility could be examined, although it is could be bringing as the broader dimension of political system, but still, should this be considered as a particular dimension, or can that be combined under the broader theme of the political system? What is your recommendation?
Yeah, I think maybe the case of Iraq in the Arab world is maybe the closest to Afghanistan, because they also had a complete system change after 2003, and this had not happened has not happened since the colonial time in most of the other Arab countries. So also an enforced change led also by Western forces, or that were very closely involved in that. So what I think is that fragility is maybe not a kind of a dimension that can shape the media system analysis in general, but we can look at it at a certain phase in time, right? So we have what maybe my suggestion would be to look at the to consider an analysis of the Afghani media system as some kind of a phase-like discussion. So you have a certain phase in that time, you have a certain phase in another time, and I'm not sure, but I consider that maybe also in a certain era we had a kind of a strong state or some strong state actors, not only that they were not only fragile ones, but they really had some power and some leverage to use. So maybe we cannot see it as some kind of an over time dimension, saying, well, it has always been fragile, it will always be fragile. But when looking at it at certain time periods, maybe it helps to identify what made or where the fragility came from, and I assume it's very often the social and the societal context that made it very fragile, because the political system was not able to include as many groups as it needed, and they did not get represented. So maybe this kind of dealing with conflict by the system, by the political actors, this can help to explain why there is fragility at a certain time, and maybe there is not so much fragility at another time. Right. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor, once again, for this comprehensive and thorough explanations about the conceptual explanation about the media system, particularly in Global South and also in MENA. That was the first keynote, and now we will have the second keynote. So I will just hand over the floor to Mr. Reza Hussaini to lead and moderate the second keynote speech.
Hello and good morning, everyone. And thank you very much, Dr. Bahar and Professor Karl Rechter. Before starting my points, I just want to remind for all audiences who are in the Zoom session that you can go to find the live stream account, and then there are 3 dots there. Then you can click on it and pin it. Then you can have the chance to see it in live stream mode. Also, you have live stream on YouTube, and the link is on the chat, so you can also use that one. It's my pleasure to introduce one of our distinguished keynote speakers for today's conference, Dr. Timur Sharan. Dr. Sharan is the author of the acclaimed book, Inside Afghanistan, where he unravels the complexities of political networks and state disruption in Afghanistan. Currently an honorary fellow at the University of Exeter, Dr. Sharan has also served as visiting fellow at the University of Oxford's Global Security Program and holds the position of Senior Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute and the Center on Armed Groups. His research focuses on the intersection of international military intervention and transnational financial flows, violence, and the political economy of international state building. Formerly the International Crisis Group's senior analyst for Afghanistan, and he was the Deputy Minister for Policy and Program for the Independent Directorate of Local Governance for the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan. Dr. Sharan brings a wealth of expertise to our discussion. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Timur Sharan. The mic is yours, Dr. Said.
Thank you so much, Hossein Aziz. Good morning, Subh Khair. Sharaq Last. I'm very pleased to be here, and it is an honor to be part of this discussion. And thank you to organizers for facilitating this conversation. It is timely that we have such conversation, especially given the polarized nature of politics in Afghanistan and the stage that we are. It's important that we have impartial and nuanced analysis emerging from our younger academics. So indeed, it is privilege. And of course, discussing media system in Afghanistan, freedom of expression and civic space as it is shrinking fast in Afghanistan, that this conversation is quite timely. What I'm going to present today is a chapter that I was asked to draft for a special volume on the future of Afghanistan. I was asked to write a chapter on the future political system in Afghanistan, including state administration and the fiscal model. And given how previous political systems in Afghanistan have failed Afghan people, this chapter is timely, and it is not necessarily related to media, but maybe at the very end I try to say a few words in how media can play a role in facilitating and promoting some of this discussion and the goals of changing, reforming the political system in Afghanistan. I will be drawing a lot on my personal professional experience when I worked at the Independent Directorate of Local Governance, responsible for the subnational governance in administrations in Afghanistan, over 34 provincial governors' offices, 364 formal district governors' offices, municipalities, villages, and districts in the country. Let me first begin by putting the conversation within a historical context. Now, Afghanistan has been marred by a vicious cycle of political instability and violence, typically characterized by Professor Goodhand as try again, and fail better. It is one of constant struggle and survival. And it seems that we have, in our modern history, haven't been able to break that vicious cycle and address some of the fundamental issues that Afghanistan is facing. Now, there are various reasons as to why we are in this vicious cycle of violence and poverty. Varies from the resilience nature of the social cultural micro-societies. As Cycle has noted that Afghanistan is a country of micro-societies and it's constantly in tension. There's tension between the state and societies. To Barfield talking about how these micro-societies, both tribal and ethnic, is always in, as more egalitarian, is in conflict with the hierarchical state structure. or to the discussion of the strategic geographical position of Afghanistan within the great power competition. Now, all of these are valid points that have been mentioned, but surprisingly, when I was writing this chapter, I realized there has been very little argument about the nature of the political system and different models that Afghanistan has adopted as part of its governance framework, and how that the choice of state structure, administratively, politically, and fiscally, has failed Afghanistan and its citizens, and address the key issue of breaking that violence, or this vicious cycle of violence that I was talking about. Now, that's the key research question here. But I think to start with, we need to go back and provide a historical context. And the historical context, let's start with Ahmad Shah Abdali's kingdom. What we know, and this is well documented, there has been extensive research about this. Ahmad Shah Abdali's political system was very much a decentralized and self-governing system, and it had an inherent mechanism of power sharing across specific tribes and ethnic groups. We can discuss the tribes, how he created a bourgeois tribes within the Ghilzais and the Ranis, but I think that's a different conversation to have another time. As Ghubar mentions it, essentially this was a Sharikut Dawla, partners of the state. So there were 7-8 Sardars who ruled different regions of the country, and these were politically, administratively, and fiscally self-governing areas. They could mobilize their own militias responsible for rule of law and safety of the population. They could levy taxes as they wished, collect revenues, and of course they had their own internal politics. But they would send a fixed amount of that revenue that was collected back to Kabul. So in that sense, it was a very decentralized and self-governing political system. Now, historically, and this is something that we could have a conversation about this, anyone has shifted, diverged from this power-sharing model that Ahmad Shah Abdali set up and its subsequent successors pursued, have led, except Abdurrahman Khan from 1880 to 1901, has sowed the root of their own demise, has led to the state collapse. Now, this has been extensively argued by people like Barfield, Amin Saikal, and others, so I'm not going to go into details. What is fascinating to know, in the 19th and 20th century, with modernization process and the involvement of great power competition, Afghanistan became a rentier state. It no longer relied on the tribes and ethnic groups to generate revenues and buy loyalties. It then relied on external money and finances and international legitimacy to secure loyalties. And that subsequently weakened the tribal and ethnic loyalties, or the relationship between society and the state. It diminished voice and political representation over the years, reduced downward accountability to tribes and communities, and weakened loyalty within the country. And that had a huge impact over this vicious cycle of violence that is re-emerging. Now, Abdurrahman Khan's period is the period who essentially, after Sher Ali Khan, has put the foundation of a very centralized state administration. And that has become what we have inherited so far, a very centralized unitary state, fiscally fiscal revenue collected by Kabul and so forth. Now, the number of constitutions that emerged from 1923 to 1964 to 2003 builds on that very model that Abdurrahman Khan has set up for us. Very centralized political system administration. It does not give voice and representation, enough voice and representation to Afghan population. It interferes and plans in the lives of ordinary Afghans, villages, and communities across the country. And that's that centralized model has always been resisted by communities, whether that is in Panjwai, Kandahar, by the Nurzais and Isarzais, or in places like Saripol and others. So that resistance has been quite rigid as a result of that political system. The second issue that I want to talk about is the current political debate about the political, administrative, and fiscal system. Now, this discussion, the current discussion, heavily politicized, overgeneralizes, and it simplifies the complexity of drafting an institutional setup and the political and technical trade-offs that is needed. And it is something that I've experienced at IDLG when I worked for the government, how complex these issues were, the machinery of the state when you try to set up a political system. There are three dominant positions have emerged in the last at least 5 decades. The first two groups refer to maintain the historically unitary state nature of the state, Afghan state, and changes within the executive and legislature. The first group advocates maintaining the status quo, a unitary state, very centralized political system, power concentrated in the presidency and in cabinet in Kabul. And this is pushed forward primarily by the ethnic Pashtun group. The second position is led by primarily in the last 5 decades by Jamiat political party, primarily led by ethnic Tajiks, who support a parliamentary system or a power-sharing model. They argue for a semi-presidential system in which executive is divided between the presidency and prime minister. So they want to create 2 positions, prime ministers and presidency position. And the prime minister is the head of the government, the president is the head of the state. Now, we'll come back to this argument. And at the other opposition end of the spectrum, the third position is advocated primarily by ethnic Uzbek and Hazara leadership, who typically support a very decentralized political system, a self-governing system, with a preference for widespread decentralization or even federalism. Now, these conversations are fascinating. It's good that we have this conversation for a healthy country, for a healthy nation. The problem lies that it simplifies things. It is misleading and self-centered rather than one around personal and group interest, rather the interest of Afghanistan as a nation and given the realities that we experience at the moment. It pays little attention to the technical aspect, to the fiscal aspect of the conversation. The political conversation is very, very limiting. There is incredible diversity in the way decentralization works, in different models of decentralization, and there are incredible diversity of political system when it comes to centralized political system. You take Indonesia, France. Yes, it is unitary centralized state, but it is incredibly also decentralized, deconcentrated at different levels that we can talk about. Pakistan is a federalist state. It's a decentralized state, and it's an absolute failure next door to us. So I think we need to be very careful in terms of what could work and what could not work and what Afghanistan needs. A discussion on the future political system in Afghanistan needs to take into account 3 aspects: political, administrative, and fiscal. Let me start by the discussion around administrative. And this is something we should, given how politicized this conversation is good to start with the administrative reform in Afghanistan, the state structure. The future administrative structure in Afghanistan needs to start with a conversation around what is the goal for the nation? What do we want to achieve in 10 years' time, in 100 years' time? What do we want? What are some of the key goals, overarching goals for us as a nation? When Singapore was developing in its political system, it asked those key questions in 1960s and 70s. What are our key goals? What do we want to achieve? Now, I think we need to focus on 4 key areas, given the current situation that we are experiencing. First, We need to promote nation building and peace building. We are a divided country, nation. We have suffered incredibly over the last centuries, and especially in the last 5 decades. Our primary goal needs to be around nation building, peace building, and the use or develop narratives that everyone could bond with. The political administrative system needs to do that for us. And a valuable lessons learned historically from other contexts, divided contexts, is that it is important that we harmonize the country's unity with an enhanced emphasis on local self-governance. I'm not talking about national level, local self-governance, which I will come to that. The second goal should be political representation and voice. I cannot emphasize more the importance of this. When I was in the government, and when I traveled across Afghanistan, and as I said, whether it was in Kandahar or Paktika or Paktia, and other parts of Bamiyan and Ghor, constant theme was we don't have voice and we don't have political representation. People wanted to be involved in decision-making processes. People wanted to be involved in things that mattered to their life, which I'll come to and discuss this. And that meant that we couldn't improve the legitimacy of the republic over the last 2 decades. And subsequently, I think ultimately that is one of the reasons we lost to the Taliban. Now, that voice has historically never been there, regardless of which political regime was in power. It never gave Afghan population at the village level, district level, and provincial enough voice that they feel that they have been empowered. The third goal should be fostering economic growth and employment. Now, that's something we don't talk about. Tunisia is a good example. People had a revolution. People's aspiration was incredibly high. But because it paid so much attention to the political dynamics, to get the politics right, it failed to focus on the economic growth and employment. And look at what the mess right now Tunisia is from 2012 onwards. It is important for us, Afghanistan, to reduce our path to foreign aid dependency and poverty. We need to break the cycle of poverty for our nation. And we need to stimulate the engine of growth and prosperity. And I'll talk about how we can do that through reforming the political system. The fourth goal for all of us should be around improving equitable and quality public service delivery. Public service, the state has always failed in Afghanistan to provide quality and equitable public service. And this is something that the public failed, previous regimes have failed. We need to do better in that regard. So those are I think the 4 key goals of us when we discuss political system, the fiscal model, the administrative structure. When we do that, then the starting point for us, I'm sorry, this is a very technical conversation, is what are the state's functions? What functions do we need to do, the state needs to do to achieve those 4 goals? There are 2 types of function, and it is important that all of us as technical people, as academics, understand this a little bit better, because we fall in that trap of that conversation around the political system. There are 2 types of state functions. There are the core functions of the state, and there are the concurrent functions of the state. The core functions of the state are following. 1, foreign affairs, foreign policy. It's Kabul that establishes, in most cases, foreign policy. In most countries, the core functions of establishing foreign policy falls under the national government, okay? But there are some exceptions in the US that federal states like California and Texas and others also do foreign policy. But in most countries, it's the domain of national government. So that's 1, foreign policy. National security, law and order. Okay, that's the concern of national government. That's the second core functions of the state. The third core function is microeconomic management, control over microeconomic management and sub-aspects of fiscal and bank management, like fiscal balancing, currency, and others. Those are the domain of national government. The fourth one is legislature and regulatory framework, which I don't need to explain. Everything else, schools, managing schools, roads, hospitals, electricity, agriculture, are concurrent functions of the state. It means you can put it anywhere you want. Kabul can do it, provinces can do it, districts can do it, villages could be involved in it, municipalities could be involved in it. And that's, I think, where we could make the most innovation when it comes to reforming the political system in Afghanistan. Okay? I don't think, and we should dispute that those core functions of the state needs to remain in Kabul, but everything else could go back, could deconcentrate, decentralize to the provinces, to the other aspect administration. So we empower the population so that we give voice and representation to the population. This is where what I'm proposing in terms of way forward. Delegate all concurrent functions of the state to subnational administration, whether these are districts, provinces, and municipalities. Okay? National administration, Kabul, should not at all directly involved in service execution and planning. That's something that historically Kabul has done. Kabul has interfered how many schools we should build, where we should build, and under conditions what we should build. That is not a conversation Kabul should have. Kabul can give strategic direction, guidance, but leave it to the provinces to decide how they want to do this. Look at China. China is an incredibly centralized political system, but when it comes to building schools, industries, and so forth, it's the provinces that decide what industries to build, how many schools to build, what to prioritize, and so forth. Let me then share my screen quickly, because I think this is, if I manage to do this. How do I share screen?
There's a green button.
Okay, share screen, yeah. So, yeah. You have my screen, yes?
Yes.
Okay. So this is the summary of the state administration that I think we should keep, and what roles, responsibilities, and functions we should keep at what levels. As I said, national level, the Office of Prime Minister, Office of President, Cabinet, governments, whatever, all of those should only formulate policy, legislation, macroeconomic management, and their role should be coordination, strategic guidance, policy formulation, oversight. Everything else needs to go to different levels. During the Republic, this is something we proposed, Ashraf Ghani proposed, and it passed through the cabinet. The establishment of regional development authorities for the purpose of economic growth. This is something new in the last 15 years or so. A lot of countries like Colombia, France, have come up with this. They have established regional development authorities. This is not an administrative unit, okay? Often it's a board, it's comprised of a board. And in this case, the Ghani's government was proposing, and which was passed through the cabinet, that we establish 8 regional development authorities. They will be responsible for pooling resources, getting enough funds from districts and provinces, because the tendency is for provinces not to collaborate with one another. And different regions of Afghanistan is connected to the different regional countries. For instance, Turkmenistan built Ashgabat with $22 billion, $30 billion marble city. Herat had some of the best marbles in the world, but we exported zero marble to Turkmenistan because Kabul was interfering. Provinces were not pooling resources, Badghis, Herat, Ghor, and others, Nimruz, so that we built our marble industry and targeted to the region. This is something a lot of countries have done. This is something we need to push for economic growth. At the provincial level, what I propose is that we make provinces, districts, and even villages a budgetary unit so that they have their own budget, okay, which would be given to the provinces, district, and the villages early on, and they would be responsible for service delivery and so forth. Provincial administration should be the primary unit of service delivery and a budgetary unit. And provincial councils would be elected by the people and would keep the provincial administrators, the governor in this case, accountable. The same formula applies for the districts and villages and so forth. Let me just say that it is important for Afghanistan, given that its population is increasing rapidly and it is going through a massive urbanization process. By 2035, half of our population will be living in cities, major cities, big cities, and medium-sized cities. For that reason, we need to give a lot more authority to municipalities, to mayors, and municipality councils, and make sure that municipalities become the engine of growth in the cities, but also across Afghanistan. The potential Kabul has in terms of generating revenue, taxing its people, collecting revenues, and then reinvesting that revenue, or Jalalabad, or Balkh, or Mazar Sharif, and others, is just incredible. The wealth of cities have not been used in Afghanistan. So let me stop sharing and go back quickly. I think I'm conscious of my time, so I don't want, this is a very technical conversation. What I'm proposing here is that we very simply give most of those concurrent functions of the state to provinces, districts, and villages in Afghanistan. The current reality of having 364 formal, at the time that I was at ITG, 387 formal and informal, and I believe Taliban have now created more districts in Afghanistan, is not based on reality. What historically the rulers have done, in order to give the facade of voice and representation to people, they created more districts. That's not the way to do it. In fact, I argue that we need to reduce the number of districts in Afghanistan from 380 something to maybe 250, and align those districts with electoral constituencies. So we need to redraw the boundaries of provinces, districts, municipalities, and villages in Afghanistan. We had around 45,000 plus villages in the country. Our villages are depopulating. People are moving to cities. So therefore, we need to reduce the number of villages in Afghanistan from 45,000 to 12,000 to 13,000, maybe 12,000 to 15,000 in Afghanistan. I move to the second part of my conversation. Now the discussion, we finished the administrative part. Now with the discussion on political system in the country. I think the last 2 decades has proven that a democratic framework could work in Afghanistan if given enough voice and representation to the people. One of the key shortcomings of the system was that the president was the head of the state and the government. It could interfere in legislature, it could appoint judges, and so forth. We need to limit the power of presidency. Okay, so what I'm proposing is a semi-presidential system for Afghanistan that would combine elements of both parliamentary and presidential system. In the constitutional design, the president should be the head of the state with a ceremonial role. Absolutely no other role except ceremonial role. And this person needs to be impartial. The president is not elected through direct popular vote, but maybe could come through some sort of a grand assembly, loya jirga, which the Senate, the lower house, the district councils, the municipality council, and others could come together every 6 years and select a president. Okay, the president has symbolic role. That's it. The key executive role would be with the prime minister. Now, the prime minister would be the head of the government. He will select his own cabinet. One point that I forgot, the president should operate on a rotational basis. So no individual from the same ethnic group can hold the position consecutively. Okay, so if you one time you had a Hazara president, the next time cannot be another Hazara president. It should be from a different ethnic group. And again, the power of the president is symbolic here. Okay, the key power lies with the prime minister and the cabinet. And the prime minister comes from the winning political party or the coalition of political parties. The key thing in this system is the role of political parties. We need to make sure that the political parties are multi-ethnic, and this is very, very important. We do not want a scenario like Lebanon and Bosnia, which has failed the country. Finally, legislature. I think what we had during the Republic was good, except that the lower house and the upper house were often came under immense political pressure and interference by the presidency. And that often the two houses were absolutely captured by criminals, by former jihadis, by businessmen and so forth, that had their own interest rather than the interest of the people. Of course, we can do a few things to resolve the issue of capture, which I don't want to talk about. We can talk about it another time. But it's important that at the national level, we have the two houses. The upper houses could be non-directly elected, and they should come from the districts and municipalities, with provinces deciding who to send and then rotating those individuals every 2 years to the upper house. We should give more oversight power, legislative and oversight power to the lower house. Finally, on the fiscal system or the fiscal model, we have always, in the last century, in the last 2 decades, we have always had a centralized fiscal model to collect revenues, taxes, fees, customs, and we have centrally redistributed our resources. It's worth noting during the Republic, 80% of the revenue came from foreign aid from the US and donors and others. The way forward, given how little we generate at the moment, maybe for now we could keep a centralized fiscal system, tax system, revenue system, but with the intention of actually, by creating those provinces, districts, and municipalities, and even village budgetary units, we could earmark, give grants to provinces, districts, municipalities, and villages according to the concurrent functions that they do. But more importantly, we should give planning and budgeting authority to these administration, provinces, district, municipalities, and so forth, so that they are involved in the planning process. They tell us, and budget themselves what they need across the district and the villages. In 2015, the Ministry of Finance with IDLG tried to do something called provincial budgeting policy, that we would give $1 million per province. In Helmand, of the 500 something plans that came to Kabul, only 2% were included in the national budget. 2%. Kabul simply ignored the demands, the needs, and priorities of a place like Helmand. Let me conclude by saying, first of all, these are very technical issues, and we shouldn't leave it to politicians to simplify for us. It requires deep discussion around what Afghanistan needs, what its population needs, what our goals and priorities are, and what kind of political setup we need to design. Second, it's important that this is not a progression. This progression does not follow a linear path. What I'm proposing is only for the next 10 years. We should come back to it and see what has worked and what hasn't worked and reform the system. So there has to be an internal mechanism in place. Third, the pace, scope, and method of the reform itself is as important as the choice of simply decentralization or centralization. And finally, any transition for any country to become meaningful and implementable needs to come gradually. It needs to be meticulously planned and managed and make sure that there is minimum potential disruptions. Now, media can play an important role, especially in around the first and the second goal, nation building, peace building. Media, in the last 2 decades, our media was incredibly dependent on, I think, pursuing an international agenda rather than the Apple's agenda. We were, and again, that's a criticism that I have put forward to our media. Our media became a vehicle, a means in the war on terror, in the US war on terror objectives, rather than the objectives of Afghanistan. I think it's important for our media to be up there upfront and pursuing those key 4 goals, building a nation, helping build a nation that is cohesive, that promotes a collective narrative, reinforces certain symbols, that is future-looking, outward-looking, rather than backward-looking to the past, which our past is miserable, and also to an inward-looking Afghanistan. The more as a nation we become inward, the more miserable and backward we will become. We need to be outward-looking to think bigger and also to the future. And finally, media has done really well in terms of giving people voice in the last 2 decades. Sadly, the space has shrunk significantly. There is significant underreporting in Afghanistan at the moment. It's important that the media continue to operate in order to give voice. My final point, and again, that's I put forward to conversation here to media colleagues. I think lessons from Myanmar, Iran, Colombia, Cuba, exile media shows that it's important for our media to remain impartial, committed to the core values of Afghanistan and its commitment to the Afghan people, rather than becoming an oppositional force. You look at Iranian media, Cuban media, Myanmar media, and others, they have become oppositional media. And by doing that, they have lost incredible credibility and legitimacy. And I think it's important for media to remain impartial and continue to raise the voice of Afghan people. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Saib. It was very well structured, focused, and insightful. Well, obviously there will be lots of questions, and I'm sure the audiences also have lots of questions. But the problem is we have a time shortage, and we need to go jump to the next speaker. So I will go with only one question. And well, you already talked about, like, I feel like what you say, that the last point is maybe is also somehow we can relate it to the do no harm principle, and also what you said about the critics. Maybe the question that came in my mind and right now is like, while talking about the overall media system, for now it was more like from the mainstream media in Afghanistan was more like a private media or private media companies rather than the state media. Like for instance, in Germany, the system is a bit different. Here, like the mainstream media are more like the government or the media that's supported by the publics. So do you think it's a good suggestion or to have like examples of Germany, for instance, like it's the public supporting the mainstream media or the television, having or more like kind of a public funded or state funded media in order to keep like impartial in that way, or no, to keep it in this way, but bring some like more principles or bring some changes on the legislation for having it in somehow control the media, to bring some controlling on the media?
A very good question, and again, not my area of expertise, so I hope that my other colleagues could address this. But I think, let me emphasize, it is important to have mechanisms in place to ensure oversight of media and not necessarily, I mean, there has to be media bill of this legislature, but I think it's, in addition to that, I think it's important that we have oversight mechanisms in place, which a lot of countries do have that, so that media functions healthily within established principles, guiding principles, values, and rules. The model in the US is a terrible model, where Fox News and others problematic. In BBC in the UK has slipped significantly in the last decade under the Tories. Again, that's a lessons learned for all of us. Historically in Afghanistan, the RTA was state-funded and became a propaganda tool during the communists, especially after Dawood Khan and the communists. And then the President Karzai didn't pay any attention to media, but Ghani tried in the last 2 to 3 years before 2019 election to use RTA as a tool to win elections. And again, so that was heavily politicized. And again, that emerged because of the lack of clear rules and legislation and oversight. And then on the other hand, as you pointed out, you had the private media, which, as I said, most of them became knowingly or unknowingly became a tool for the wider US war on terror rather than the national interest of Afghanistan and the interest of the Afghan population. That's a general overview. It's not my expertise, by the way.
Yeah, thank you very much again. Well, there's another question. Maybe I will just have this question from my colleague, Dr. Bahar. He said media should remain impartial to core values of Afghanistan. This is what you have said. So he asked, what do you mean by core values?
No, I guess what I meant was the core goals that I set up in my conversation. You look at countries like Indonesia, they have come up, not values, they have come up with principles for the nation. So they have 5 or 6 principles that is embedded in the constitution in Indonesia, and which politicians abide by it, media abide by it, and so forth, political parties and so forth. And those are around respect for diversity in Indonesia, the collective national identity. There are a few others. So I think those principles are key. I mean, Indonesia have been quite smart in terms of embedding those in the constitution, creating a narrative around it that bonds around 16,000 islands together, which is incredible. So I guess we need a narrative that is outward looking, that is progressive to the future, looks to the future, and ensures that we abide by those principles. And again, along those principles, then you can develop values. And again, if you abide by democratic values, that's what I meant by democratic values: freedom of expression, freedom of rights, all sorts of rights, and freedom of diversity and others.
Yeah, once again, thank you very much for your fruitful talks. So now I would like to continue and introduce with our next and last keynote speaker, Mr. Boris Alam. Mr. Boris Alam, with a career spanning over 2 decades, is a represented journalist and civil society activist who has played a significant role in Afghanistan's communication and media landscape. In 2002, he founded Afghanistan's first public service radio, Good Morning Afghanistan, highlighting his dedication to fostering opening dialogue and civic engagement, currently directing Afghanistan's media portfolio at the United States Institute of Peace. Mr. Salam continues to contribute to the advancement of media and public diplomacy. His experience includes the establishment and leadership of the Channel 7 television and Now Media Production, where he successfully implemented over 30 strategic communication projects and grants for both the US and Afghan government. Without further ado, let us warmly welcome Mr. Barish Salam to share his insights. Mic is yours, Dr. Barish Salam. Bye Salam. Sorry, we cannot hear you.
I'm so sorry. Sorry for that. Okay, I say thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking the Leipzig University and co-organizers for today's conference and giving me the opportunity to have a presentation as well on a topic that's very dear to my heart. I apologize if I may sound a little sleepy or tired because I rose at 2 o'clock in the morning for this program. I live in a different time zone. So apologies for that. Back in 2002, actually, when we first founded Good Morning Afghanistan, the first independent radio station in Afghanistan, I remember that we, for so many days, my colleagues and I worked overnight or for 24 hours in a row just to get one story done or to the heart of one single story. But those days are gone, so I don't have the same strength. But coming to the state of media in Afghanistan, I should proudly say that media is perhaps the only democratic institution that has survived the Taliban takeover. It has obviously lost its once very powerful role as the fourth state, but it still remains a critical tool for both advancing free speech, advocating for people's rights, and also providing a information platform for our people. So today I would have a quick overview of media in the past 20 years, and then what really caused the Taliban to retain media, although under their tight control, and what are some of the key challenges and opportunities that we can build on to further the media freedom in Afghanistan. And that obviously requires a collective approach. So I would start with a few words, because all of us are familiar with how media was in the past 20 years, with a few words about the emergence of free media in Afghanistan. As we all concur, the rise of independent media in Afghanistan was one of the most remarkable achievements of the last 2 decades. Before the collapse of the Republic, we had over 500 independent media outlets operating across Afghanistan. We had one of the most democratic media law in the region, and perhaps one of the most liberal access to information law in the world, which was adopted in very recent years. We're not talking about its applicability, but at least as a law. So Afghanistan had become, in fact, an inspiring model of free media in the whole region. Media was not just a source of information, entertainment, and education, but it was also a driving force for change. It promoted pluralism, empowered women, and enabled marginalized ethnic and religious communities to establish their own outlets while pursuing equal rights and opportunities. So media culture had become so deeply ingrained in society that even people in remote and most impoverished parts of the country endeavored to purchase and install dish antennas to watch soap operas, music contests, and football leagues and other reality TV, television programs. So I want to remember one of the story that we did in Good Morning Afghanistan of a man from Ghor who came to Herat to work for several months to earn enough money to buy a dish antenna and a solar panel so that he could take back to Ghor so that his wife could watch the famous Indian series on Tolo Tulsi. And we have so many stories like that. So media contributed greatly to not just freedom of expression and democratic values, but to other areas and arenas such as sports and music. And this in turn promoted cultural cohesion in an otherwise highly diverse and fragmented society. So what happened was that with the media landscape undergoing significant transformation during the democratic era, the resurgent Taliban also began adapting its information strategy. So they effectively co-opted the new media environment and gave up on a lot of policies that could have negatively affected their effective exploitation of media platforms. The most notable example was incorporation of visual communication tools in their propaganda campaigns. As we remember, as of 2005, even 2004, but more in a more structured way as of 2005, they started using pictures, drawings, graffitis, videos, and online platforms more widely, which they had banned or opposed during its first reign from 1996 to 2001. So unlike the Republic, they learned how to leverage the power of media to communicate their messages more effectively to their target audiences. So Taliban's communication was far more effective than their opponents. I won't go into much of details, but there's a lot of literature produced on this. And I did a recent article on it as well that I slightly expand on that part as well. So they were very consistent in their messaging. They employed targeted messaging, and they weaponized media to intimidate their critiques and opponents alike. So I would leave the details for a later discussion, but since much of it is irrelevant to our discussion today, but it's worth noting that Taliban's communication strategy and media exploitation skills played an instrumental role in their resurgence to power, but also for retaining the media outlets post-takeover. So why they opted for a controlled media environment? When they gained power in August 2021, Taliban chose to retain but strictly regulate and control the media. During the insurgency, they repeatedly highlighted that wars cannot be won without media. So my personal take is that Taliban till this day value media's role as a strategic tool and even as a weapon to promote their narrative and legitimacy. So we should remember that Taliban's view of media is solely utilitarian and not out of respect for democratic values. We remember how they threatened, attacked, and even massacred our journalists. So after takeover, all they did was to replace direct attacks with harassment, intimidation, censorship, and control. Now, I also believe that Taliban's control over independent media is not absolute. Why? Because first, if they push for total control, that might potentially lead to the closure or exile of more independent channels. And this is not a favorable scenario for the Taliban, because they would not want to lose the leverage that and control that they currently have over a significant number of media which are operating inside the country. Sorry, my coffee. So therefore, the Taliban appear to have opted for a relatively accommodating approach. And that approach is to allow media operation in exchange for enhanced control and self-promotion. We must also remember that the media within the country operate under a lot of pressure. So in order to avoid retribution, the media outlets try to thread a fine line. And what is that? Being as objective as they can, while also giving the Taliban stories a fair treatment. Now, that brings us to the key challenges. Taliban's tactics for controlling the independent media is quite harsh. It includes harassment, regulatory restrictions, and controlling the flow of information. Since August 2021, there have been over 300 incidents of mistreatments against journalists and media outlets, from personal assaults and violence to short and long imprisonments and surprise raids and closing down of media outlets. They have issued multiple decrees and vague guidelines, and I fear that there might be more in the pipeline. And the other biggest issue is that that allows Taliban to manipulate their power and leverage over media is lack of a governing media law. Sharan discussed this in his the last part of his speech. So when you don't have media law, then obviously there is a vacuum that everybody can exploit in their own favor, and that's why there is a significant disparity or change of behavior among the Taliban officials across different I would say provinces of Afghanistan. So in one province, for example, in some provinces, authorities even demand journalists to submit their news bulletins for approval even before it goes for broadcasting or publishing. So it's hard for journalists to determine where to draw the boundaries in order to avoid reprisals or seek legal protection against persecution. Another challenge is that Taliban heavily scrutinize media content in order to control the flow of information. This was perhaps one of the reasons that several media outlets left the country, like Hashd Sob and Italat Rose. They have even taken punitive measures to limit access to information that they perceive harmful to their power or reputation. In addition to these challenges, media are also faced with financial hardships due to lack of donor assistance and commercial income. I mean, there are many other challenges, like capacity deficits is one of the greatest challenges right now, because many of the experienced journalists and editors have left the country, and even those media outlets who have reasonably good amount of income, or they're supported by either donors or businesses, they lack the necessary human resources to produce the kind of quality programming that they aim for. Now, coming to opportunities and some of the emerging trends and pushbacks on the part of the journalists and media outlets, I must say that journalists and media outlets have shown remarkable resilience in keeping up their good work and preserving their relative independence. I say relative because we must accept that the editorial independence or the independence of operation is now compromised. So, as I said before, journalists have to navigate a fine line to still report in a way to retain their credibility, but also on the other hand, not not get in trouble. So it's a very delicate situation, and it requires a lot of caution and a lot of maneuvering, but a lot of commitment as well. So we must take this opportunity to appraise all national and local televisions and radio stations who have remained in the country. I mean, to name a few, like Tolo, Shamshad, Aryana, Kelly, Salam Watandar, they're all still there. And in addition to that, according to estimates, there are over 30 local televisions and 100 community radio stations still operating inside the country, including around 10 to 15 women-operated stations. So cable networks that carry foreign channels are still operational, at least in major cities. Correct me if I'm wrong. I get feedbacks from my family members in Kabul regularly on that and what they carry. Basically, if it's just I've seen that even they still carry some Indian and Turkish, basically, soap operas and entertaining shows, but also some news channels in English. So media still remain one of the few select sectors where women are still permitted to work. That's the great news. That may change. I have been hearing alarming rumors, which I hope are not true. But nevertheless, women are still active, both in terms of leading media outlets, but also working in the background, in the newsrooms, and also presenting certain shows. So self-censorship is widespread as a result of Taliban harassment, but nevertheless, journalists have in countless instances pushed the boundaries by raising critical voices, covering citizen protests, and questioning Taliban edicts. Most importantly, their decrees on banning women's education and work. So we cannot say that media inside the country, they cannot be critical. They have time and again shown that they can challenge authorities, at least on issues that there's widespread public support or international pressure, at least. So another development is prominent advocacy organizations are slowly resuming their operation, and hopefully they should be getting more support from international donors. I hope, because their work is crucial in terms of defending the rights of journalists and advocating for freedom of expression. Normally they served, when we were in Afghanistan, always as a bridge between media outlets and authorities. So I hope they can play that important role in days and months to come. Another very exciting trend is the emergence of media in exile. I believe this can deter Taliban from further media repression or shutdown, because they know that they cannot suppress voices by just banishing an outlet. And if they banish more outlets, they would definitely lose the relative leverage that they have over media outlets operating inside the country. So that's why media in exile also play a significant role in countering the Taliban's disinformation campaign. And as I have said before, they're the ones who take the first shot at more sensitive topics like, women's rights issues, and but also inclusivity, persecution of disenfranchised communities, things like that. So they basically paved the way for further coverage by internal media. Another development is that citizen journalism is gaining momentum as well. And people not only publish on digital platforms themselves, but they share a lot of footages, valuable stories with media in exile. So that in turn also helps for broadening people's access to information. And Taliban know that, and we know that we're living in a digital era now. So there's so much that they can do with controlling the flow of information. People, one way or the other, would find their ways to access information. So online platforms will play an indispensable role in providing citizens with easier access to information despite the Taliban crackdown. However, we must do everything we can to protect the existing media outlets, both inside and outside the country, and continue to work on platforms to facilitate people's access to wider internet use, because internet use is, at the end of the day, it's limited, and also continue to broaden the advocacy platforms, especially those that involve international community, to advance freedom of expression for all people and protect what we have, at least today, remaining of media freedoms and other democratic values inside the country. So this all requires our unity of efforts and, of course, a lot of technical and financial resources that I hope the donor community will help provide. And we as journalists and media advocates must do all we can to make sure that that happens. I'm doing that on my part, just as an individual, as a committed former journalist. And we must make sure that media and freedom of expression is not forgotten. That's one last democratic achievement that we must protect at all costs. So I would stop here. That was not a speech, but some notes that I had here and there that I had to put together in a short time that I had available to me, given a lot of other official engagements and family preoccupations that I have had over the past few weeks. So I'd be happy to engage in a discussion after this, and if you have any questions, I would be happy to take. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your contribution, and I know it's hard to wake up early in the morning and attending, of course, with this time zone differences. Well, it was really insightful, and before jumping to the questions, I just want to quote one sentence, which I think it was relevant to one part of your talks, and also it is somehow related to my research, because I used also doing research on the utilization of Twitter by the Taliban during the collapse of the state and after that, and before that. So I think Broken and Senger in their book Weaponization of Social Media have a very good saying, and one of their core theses, and they said social media not only changed the nature of conflict, but also the shape and the character of conflict, and I think that's also very important. And with this, I'm coming with this question that, based on my research and findings, before the collapse of a state in Afghanistan, or at least on Twitterverse, we have three independent players, or three types of players. The first one was the government and all those who supported like the government narratives. And then we have, of course, from the other side, the Taliban and those who support the Taliban narratives. And then we have the third one, which was most of the private media outlets in Afghanistan, which they have totally somehow different narratives. It wasn't, we couldn't say that like most of the time they support the government or what we later we call it as a Republican ideology or the Republican system. So why do you think this happened? Why we could keep the diversity at the same time a harmony within our diversity, so we could have one like private media outlets or all other media outlets in Afghanistan that who believes on democratic values, and at the same time the government in one side rather than having them as a different side before the collapse of the state. And I think there is another research which happened with four joint research with four North American universities. They have one of their significant results says like the Taliban activity on Twitter was 18 times more than 4 times more than 18 independent and government media outlets. So it shows like how big was their scale of works and how big was their outreach. But in the other side, the government and the independent media outlets was separated in two different actors. How this happened, and also maybe you can also talk about the importance of how or when the media outlets should define the do no harm, and then they should respect, and to what extent they respect the do no harm principle as well, or even can we apply do no harm principles on the media outlets or no at all?
Well, thank you so much. I mean, great reflections. It's really hard. I mean, looking at media outlets in Western countries, you could pose basically the same questions that you would pose to media outlets in Afghanistan. It's not much different. But in a crisis situation, obviously, it requires the players to be cognizant of the media's role in shaping public opinion, in advancing agendas, in winning the war, and in instrumentalizing media to advance your narrative. This was done very effectively, obviously, by the Taliban over the 20 years. As I said, they had, first of all, they had a narrative, which we didn't. They had a narrative. Their narrative was defined. They had defined their enemy, right? They defined their way of war. They had defined their tools and means. And obviously, they knew what they were fighting for, and they knew how to recruit and how to win hearts and minds. So they had it established. They had it figured out. But on the other side, unfortunately, as far as the Republic was concerned, it was leading a disjointed and at times self-defeating media campaign. It basically promoted more the Taliban in the name of peace than the Republic and its values. And we had seen that on RTA, but also on the interviews and on the media campaigns that they were carrying. The peace process, more specifically, was a tool that the Taliban used to advance their agenda, to promote their image, and to get their messages across to both people in Afghanistan and to the international community, while the Republic, you know, used the same narrative or the same, I would say, subject, being peace, to undermine itself on a regular basis. Now, that's a more of a political discussion than a, you know, communications discussion, because there were obviously political motives that drove that communication strategy, right? That disjointed and incoherent communication strategy. I cannot speak for the government, but I can speak to some extent for the independent media. I can say that independent media did not have its red lines as well. It had its own fair share of contribution to promoting the Taliban's image as well. Well, it was, we as the independent media had engaged in a lot of internal discussions to figure out how to treat the Taliban stories, but we were very late. We could not come to a conclusion. So everybody somehow went their own way. And at the end, it was the Taliban who benefited from continued coverage and expanded coverage of their activities, both by their own platforms, by the international platforms and media outlets, but also independent media inside Afghanistan. I remind you of how, on the one hand, as of 2014, they started systematically attacking, killing, and even massacring journalists, but on the other hand, establishing regular contact with journalists and feeding them on daily basis their news stories. That's called a strategy, and that was successful because they were intimidating journalists, but on the other hand, they were connecting with them at the same time to retain their cooperation, and they're getting their news stories across, while also having a lot of, you know, agency on social media and digital platforms. So I mean, thank you for raising that. I haven't done a huge research on how Taliban's exploitation of digital media. I had a, you know, limited insight into that, but the thing is that they had won the information war at large, but they were the one who were dominating basically social media and digital media, and we were nowhere to be seen there, especially the Afghan government. So the independent media did not have a red line. They did not have a red line. Let's say, so where's the red line for, let's say, freedom of expression or free media? Well, that's debatable. Or for democracy at a larger scale, would you grant the same democratic rights to someone who is fundamentally against democracy? Because as soon as they come to power, they use that democratic leverage, right, to come to power. And as soon as they come to power, they would strip you of that same power that you've granted them in the first place. So would you that's a debate to be made among the professionals. But what I can say is that we could not came to a fair conclusion, and at the end, we ended up, as free and private media, ended up falling to the Taliban's trap of being exploited equally by them as their own propaganda tools. So that's what I can say to how we were, how we conducted ourselves. I'm not saying it was intentionally, but indirectly and unintentionally, we did contribute to the Taliban's resurgence to power.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, there are two questions which I think somehow they are they have like almost the same question or almost the same. So it's about the role of NGOs and international community on supporting the media. So what do you think? What's the role of international community on supporting the media for right now? And specifically, what are the three priorities for NGOs and donor community to supporting the media and civil society?
So are we expanding this to civil society now?
Well, that's how they
okay. Well, I mean, we could say civil society as well, but let's focus primarily on media. So I would say that currently, I mean, without the international help, it's really very difficult for independent media outlets to survive. I noted in my opening remarks that we currently, commercially, there's no income right now inside the country. It's fallen, according to some figures, by 80%. So, and that 20% is also absorbed by the most popular, and they could be a few. So the rest of the media outlets would be left with almost nothing. And we know that economy plays a significant role in media's independence. If they don't have, if they get paid by someone who have a political agenda, then obviously they would be running based on that agenda. And that's a great fear. While we really appreciate the existence of current independent media in Afghanistan, but without finding the right mechanisms to make them financially also independent, they would be, there's the risk that they would ultimately either get closed down or, disappear, like many have, or be controlled by those who have political agendas and who have also money to invest in. So that's why in one of the recent articles I authored, I called for both technical and financial assistance for media outlets, and that can, cover as many areas as possible. But basically, one area that I think media outlets should be assisted with is content production. So the first one is content production, quality content production. And that's what we lack at the moment as far as many are concerned. And then the second area is capacity building, right? Capacity building, there's a lot of capacity deficit. So we need to train and raise a new generation of journalists because many have left the country. The third area I would say is operational safety. Journalists are operating under tremendously difficult conditions, and they need to be equipped with the right tools and equipment to protect their sources, protect their information, and also be able to communicate with their sources, safely and effectively. So that one. And then we also need advocacy mechanisms created, and for that we need to support or find ways to reactivate our media associations and support organizations inside the country, because they, as I said, they serve as a bridge between media and authorities, and they should be the one defending basically the journalists' rights. We should do everything we can through also advocacy to see if we can bridge the legal gap that exists at the moment. I don't know, I can't proclaim that a bad law is better than no law, but we should have something in place so that journalists know what to base their operation on. And then there should be an absolute priority given to our female journalists, both in terms of supporting their operations, providing them with training, but also inventing financial schemes that can fund long-term operation of women-led media outlets, but also paying salary for female journalists, because first of all, it's very difficult for media outlets to hire female journalists, given all the risks involved, and secondly, they would look at how much value they can add to the programming, right? So if there's some part of support provided from outside sources, I'm sure that they would overlook some of the risks and be able to, hire more female journalists. And then we should also have a mechanism where we can assess those who are facing security threats. I'm sure somebody from our supporters should be in here who are assisting safety mechanisms inside the country, and that's very important to be maintained. So these are some of the areas that there are more, but that came to my mind.
Yeah, thank you. I think that what you have said is very valid, and especially the terms of the perception about impartiality, and maybe also the support with the foreign support. The two other issue will raise is also the issue of sustainability and also the issue of creativity, especially when media outlets or the mainstream media outlets are in a consistent competition with the freelancers who are like doing citizen journalists and YouTube and some other social media platforms. So with this, once again, I would like to appreciate your contribution and today's in this part of the conference. Now we have a long break or a lunch break. Our panel will start at 1:30 or 13:30, and it's going to be about the media system of Afghanistan, how was and is it's structured. And the moderator will be Dr. Hazrat Bahar, and our guest speaker for this panel will be Professor Wajma Osman, Lutfullah Najafizadeh, and Professor Abdul Qahar Javed.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'll go and take a nap. You guys go get lunch. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Have a good day.